We begin episode 1 of Run On with a similar split-screen montage to start up as our two lead characters prepare for the Annam International Film Festival. Mi-ju excitedly runs through the crowds to catch a glimpse of these famous people, including Jae-woo and her son Seon-jae. Jae-woo speaks to an interviewer about her new upcoming project. As she talks, Jae-woo catches a glimpse of an excited hyperactive Mi-ju outside, and it seems like she's a super fan. She even writes a note on her phone complimenting the woman's skin. Seon-jae eventually meets his friends outside, and together they get tickets to see Gone is the Night. Among those in attendance is Park Mae-yi, who takes out her phone and takes a picture just as the film finishes. It turns out Mi-ju's job is actually to do the subtitle translation for movies. As fate would have it, it turns out her ex-boyfriend is director Han. At dinner that night, Mi-ju does her best to grin and bear the lavish praise heaped on director Han. When the professor winds up drunk, he splashes Mi-ju when she refuses his suggestion of moving to another bar. Mi-ju lays into the professor for his comments about her pretty face and bites back some well-written dialogue about female empowerment. As things escalate, the professor eventually loses his wig. On her way home, Mi-ju bumps into Seon-jae, who watches as Han chases after Mi-ju. He grabs her wrist and tries to take her home, but Mi-ju is having none of it. Given Mi-ju's lighter is in the shape of a gun, Seon-jae holds it up to Han's face and threatens to fire. Only, fireworks in the distance completely catch him off guard, allowing Mi-ju time to escape. The next day, Seon-jae continues to practice track and field, as it turns out his friends are all on the team too. There's no love lost between him and Young Il though, and as we soon see, there's trouble in paradise. The rookie, Woo-sik, sports bruises all over his body, where the other boys have beaten him. Seon-jae tells him to take photos and get a doctor's note too. Meanwhile, Mi-ju heads off to find Professor Hwang in a bid to give him back his wig. Hwang is obviously not happy about what's happened and even takes her interpreting gig away to Spider. On the back of this, Mi-ju recruits her friend Mae-yi to help, as she pleads one more time to the professor. He instead rings Assemblyman Kai, throwing a lifeline to Mi-ju in the form of interpreting Seon-jae while he's doing track. Meanwhile, Dan-ae happens to be the CEO of a sports agency. After swimming that night, she rings Dong Kyung, who happens to be in the car with Seon-jae's sister, Yoon-bil. As they drive, Dan-ae finds out about interpreting gig, something she's none too happy about given Seon-jae is her client. Out in the street, Mi-ju tries to buy a new gun, but the man runs off with the goods and the money. Mi-ju tries to chase until she passes Seon-jae on the way. He grabs his friend's bag and shows off his skills, throwing it at the man's head and knocking him out. While Mi-ju berates the passed-out thief on the floor, she realizes that Seon-jae was the one who threw the bag. As police rush to the scene, they see Mi-ju with the gun and force her into the station to fill out a report. Seon-jae's there too, and the two engage in some witty banter as they get their wires crossed over what they're both saying. Afterwards, Mi-ju asks for Seon-jae's number to invite him out to eat at some point in the future. After referring to him as John Wick, Seon-jae begins researching who this is online. Mi-ju meanwhile shows up at the sports center the next day, ready for her new job. Only, Dan-ae shows up and mentions how she owns the athlete she's about to be interpreting for. Dan-ae is incredibly icy toward her, and even threatens to fire the girl from her job unless she gets down on her knees and begs. Mi-ju is insistent, though, and eventually she's allowed to carry on. Dan-ae simply laughs this off as Seon-jae shows up. The two formally introduce themselves, with Seon-jae shooting a finger gun her way, a cheesy reference to what they've been through in the. We begin episode 2 of Run On with Seon-jae and Mi-ju meeting for the first time. Well, officially anyway. With Dan-ae overseeing their chat, she leaves and promises to send the gopher all the details needed. Mi-ju wanders off muttering under her breath, picking up a newspaper for herself and seeing an article depicting gossip about Taerai and Seon-jae dating. She's not the only one looking at the news though, as Seon-jae checks the article and explains his actions. It turns out he met the famous Taerai, but didn't remember who she was. The picture taken by reporters was following a playful punch on her part for him not remembering. In town, Mi-ju bumps into Seon-jae and asks for her lighter back. Only, it happens to be at the training center, and he doesn't have it right now. As they talk together, Seon-jae mentions the current scandal circulating and how he's not dating anyone. Eventually she manages to convince him to ask her out for dinner in the near future. Mi-ju struggles to focus on work, though in the wake of Seon-jae's schedule being sent over. He messages her, while doing track featuring a list of prospective times and dates to meet up. She selects one of the options, before learning from Mei that Han has won the Best Picture award. Upon looking through the pictures, she even learns about Sean Jaim and how his mother is Jaiwoo. Back at the track field, Woo-sik finds himself bullied by the others' boys. He's forced to hold up a plank of wood, while Jae-deok beats him down and punches repeatedly. With a wood plank in hand, they beat him to a bloody pulp and hurry away. Sean Jaim sees them leave in the pouring rain and races up to help. There, he finds Woo-sik semi-conscious on the ground. Sean Jaim rushes him to hospital, but it's clear he's in a bad way. Woo-sik finally admits to this and opens up, crying his eyes out as Seon Jaim promises to cover his hospital bills. On his way out, Woo-sik tells him he's scared, especially after hitting Jae-deok. Seon Jaim heads straight back to the locker room and hits Jae-deok with a stiff punch across the jaw. The two fight viciously and eventually Seon Jaim leaves the room with Jae-deok and Guy being a battered and bruised mess. Afterwards, he heads straight in to see the coach and admits he's assaulted both boys. The coach knew all about the abuse, though, and wants Seon Jaim to simply cover everything up. He's having none of it, though, and demands to see the disciplinary committee. With the international contest for the track team in a year's time, Seon Jaim's future lies in jeopardy. His pride gets the better of him, though, and he eventually heads home. Back at Danae's academy, Danae tells her brother to sort himself out, leaving the smashed flower pot in the office for him to clean up. Mi-min jumps in to help, but it's clear Tae-woong is the odd one out in the family. Mi-ju continues to work with her subtitle translations, but at the coffee shop, runs into Danae who shows up and takes a seat opposite her. She feigns being asleep before eventually grilling Ju-kyung over what she knows and where she met Seon Jaim. On the way out the door she admires the artwork on the wall, changing the lighting to accentuate the colors. Only, in doing so she unfortunately gets paint all over herself. Danae wants the painting for herself, and eventually talks to the owner, buying it for double the price the shop bought it for. As she leaves, Young-hwa shows up, and learns that someone has bought his painting. He's also formally introduced to Mi-ju too, who finally meets him away from the thrown bag incident last episode. The cold-hearted Danae finds Seon Jaim in her office, and laughs about him striking out at the other kids. Seon Jaim doesn't find it particularly funny, though, and after telling her what really happened, leaves the office. On the way out though, he runs into Jae, the head of Choi Tae-rai's agency. He's struggling to get through to Danae. Seon Jaim holds the man off long enough for his car to be towed away for illegal parking. The next day, Seon Jaim realizes he's forgotten about the meeting with Mi-ju, who messages several times asking exactly where he is. As Seon Jaim rushes down the street, he runs straight past Mi-ju. When Mi-ju lets him know, Seon Jaim quickly bolts back and greets her. It turns out he selected the wrong date originally. Still, the pair head out together and go to the cinema. It's an English film with subtitles, but the pair stay until the very end, where Mi-ju sees the credits for her translation show up at the end. After, they head out for a business dinner together to discuss the movie they've just seen and Mi-ju's career and dreams. As they keep eating, the attention turns to Seon Jaim, who mentions his career and how he used to be a javelin thrower before a sprinter. Seon Jaim is quite the lightweight and Mi-ju calls him out for flirting. As they stare into one another's eyes, Mi-ju pulls back and bids farewell as they both go their separate ways until Mi-ju returns and decides to walk a drunk Seon Jaim to his car. There, he runs into Tae-rai, which is clearly a coincidence, but her agent doesn't see it that way until Mi-ju shows up on course. Realizing there's reporters nearby, Seon Jaim uses that to his advantage and kisses Mi-ju, claiming she's his girlfriend. As she looks on in shock, he smiles at her. After their kiss last episode, episode 3 of Run On begins with Seon Jaim collapsing into Mi-ju's arms and passing out from drinking too much. Tae-rai immediately confronts the reporters in their car and tells them not to say anything, or it could come back and see them sued. Seon Jaim awakens in the morning and gets dressed up. Only, the clothes Mi-ju has for him include a leopard print shirt and tight jeans. As they eventually sit down to eat, Seon Jaim promises to do the dishes afterwards. As he asks how he came to be there, we cut back in time to a hilarious flashback involving Seon Jaim clinging to Mi-ju's back in his drunken state. After eating, Mi-ju gives Seon Jaim a lift to the hospital. Only, on the way he decides to pick up a stuffed toy for Woo-sik. That stuffed toy comes from her perfect sharpshooting skills at the arcade. She wins him a large teddy and hands it over as the conversation turns to their kiss. He brushes it off as nothing, but Mi-ju takes offense and eventually leaves. Sean Jiam shows up at the hospital and meets Woo Sik, handing over the teddy, while he chuckles at Sean Jiam's flamboyant clothes. Eventually though he thanks Sean Jiam and bows deeply. Leaving the hospital, it's clear that Sean Jiam is caught up on Mi-ju, but has a family arrangement to attend at 3 p.m. the following day, which serves as enough of a distraction to keep his mind off things. Along with his sister, Sean Jiam shows up at his father's house as pictures are snapped of their reunion. Sean Jiam tries his best to look happy in their family portrait, but it's clear that he's anything but. Mi-ju meanwhile, checks the news and sees the pictures uploaded of Sean Jiam. Deliberating over his previous words, she wonders when there was a time he wasn't comfortable with how public their family's life is. Anyway, Sean Jiam is immediately berated by his assemblyman father, Kai Jeongdu, at lunch. Sean Jiam's transgressions reflect badly on him, and he makes a point of reminding his son of this. As Sean Jiam fights his case, Kai smashes a plate and eventually walks away, wishing them a happy anniversary. Yunbai follows him outside and hands over a bag of food to say goodbye. Mi-ju meanwhile winds up watching La La Land and cries at the ending. As she curses her friend for picking such an emotional film to translate, she heads out afterwards and admires the beautiful sunset. The same sunset, as it turns out, that Sean Jiam happens to be eating japchae too. Dan-A speaks to Yunbai and informs her that she's managed to sort out the situation with the assault. This all goes away as the two boys from the track team drop their statements to the track team committee. They chalk it up to a simple misunderstanding and decide against condemning Sean Jiam for assault. After a run-in with the track team members, Sean Jiam gets a taxi home, while Mi-ju is summoned to see Congressman Kai. He tasks Mi-ju with keeping his son under control, handing over an envelope of money, and telling her to report to him over everything Sean Jiam gets up to. With an envelope of money, Mi-ju walks away with a lot to think about. The next day, Yunbai and Sean Jiam show up to an interview, where Mi-ju is working as a translator. She immediately calls out the interviewer for speaking English and only questioning Yunbai. It's a brief moment, but one that helps Sean Jiam look at her more favorably, before she hurries off, unable to look at Sean Jiam over what she's been made to do. Later that evening, Sean Jiam startles Mi-ju as he heads out for a run, and taps her on the shoulder in the park. Eventually he manages to calm her down, and encourages Mi-ju to wait, while he goes back on the track circuit and continues practicing. Deliberating over Woo Sik's words, Sean Jiam eventually walks with Mi-ju and talks about his dreams. He doesn't have a clear reason for running, and is really struggling to find his spark. In the morning, Woo Sik returns to training to watch Sean Jiam and the others run. Sean Jiam sits with him where Woo Sik admits that he's not happy he can't run. He's also wondering whether to forgive Jae-deok or not. Sean Jiam simply shrugs, telling him he doesn't have to, if he doesn't want to. The first day of off training begins, and Sean Jiam immediately confronts his father as he realizes to his dismay that he's paid off the bullies. Sean Jiam's obviously not happy, and Mi-ju can sense something is up when she watches him train. Sean Jiam eventually makes a bold decision not to run, and walks away after the first race. Unlike Woo Sik who's clearly driven by this, Sean Jiam admits to the press that he didn't run because, well, he couldn't. He openly admits to assaulting his juniors and promises to face whatever consequence may come his way. Mi-ju can only watch in shock as the episode comes to Episode 4 of Run On begins right where we left off as Sean Jiam admits to assaulting his juniors and calls on Mi-ju to translate his words. She does too, and as they walk away Congressman Kai and Dan-A are both put in an awkward position. So much so that Dan-A even tasks her associate with dumping water on the reporters to fry their electronics. Unfortunately things are made worse when the media begin to assume Woo Sik's injuries were actually caused by Sean Jiam. Backstage, Kai shows up, but Sean Jiam has more than enough ammo to use against him. He hits back at his father's scolding, telling him he never cared about his own son, bringing up Kai's disappointment when Sean Jiam's shoulder was injured. Kai's first thought was how his javelin career was over. Sean Jiam eventually leaves and takes Mi-ju with him. Kai turns his attention to the coach and his boys though, telling them he's keeping an eye on them from here on out. Backstage, Woo Sik is coerced to follow an English reporter, but with no translator, he's in a tough spot. However, Dan-A manages to keep him isolated and away from prying eyes and ears for now. She liaises with them herself and gathers all the reporters to concoct the real story surrounding what happened. A story that involves Woo Sik being the victim in all this. Sean Jiam and Mi-ju arrive on Jeju Island and wind up sharing lunch together. There, they discuss running in everyday life, rather than on the track, with specific mention of seeing Ji-am running toward her on a date. When they get back, Kai tries to pay off Mi-ju with plane tickets. She refuses though, despite taking the initial bribe, and tells Kai's secretary that her job isn't done yet. Shrugging his shoulders, he leaves after completing his task, while Mi-ju does her best not to let scandalous articles online about Seon Ji-am's situation bother her. Dan-ae briefs Seon Ji-am on what to expect from the media as they prepare for a wave of questions to come. Just before they head out to greet them, Seon Ji-am tells Mi-ju to miss out the part about him assaulting the boys to help Woo-sik. Worried about Assemblyman Kai, he's apparently doing this to make sure she's not hurt. Mi-ju however is having none of it, and tells him they need to reveal the truth, and doesn't care about the repercussions. The truth needs to come out. The interviews go ahead, and Mi-ju translates Woo-sik's words exactly as he says them. Afterwards, Woo-sik promises to buy her a meal one day as a thank you. With the interview done, Seon Ji-am catches up with her, and offers to drive her to the airport. She refuses but does tell him she likes him. While Seon Ji-am cracks on with his photo shoot, Mi-ju heads home. Lee Young-hwa meanwhile, shows up at the academy, and sees a ring at the bottom of the swimming pool. Unfortunately Dan-ae startles him, and he falls headfirst in the water. Whoops. Dan-ae helps him out, but really she's only doing so to get her jewelry back. She's having absolutely none of his cheesy one-liners or flirting either, instead tasking him with painting her a picture. He does his best to thaw that icy heart, and he manages to chip away at it just a teensy bit before leaving. Seon Ji-am meanwhile finally says goodbye to the track, admitting to himself that he only originally started running to run from Assemblyman Kai. Now that his father is heavily invested in the progress of his son, Seon Ji-am has seemingly lost his motivation. Mi-ju returns to Dan-ae, and receives a pretty frosty reception. That is only made worse when Mi-ju learns that Seon Ji-am likes her, but originally liked Dan-ae too, which just makes things awkward. Mi-ju holds her own against the Ice Queen this time and eventually leaves. As she does, Dan-ae comments that Mi-ju is pretty smart. When Mi-ju shows up at Seon Ji-am's hotel room, he calls her out immediately for being paid by his father. She admits to taking the money as the episode comes to a close. Seon Ji-am is berated over his social media profile as episode 5 of Run-On begins. Assemblyman Kai's secretary warns him not to trust Mi-ju, but Seon Ji-am sees sense and tells him he's the bad person here. As we jump back in time, we see Seon Ji-am forgiving Mi-ju for taking the bribe, as she explains, it's not the first time this has happened. Mi-ju tells him to forget everything between them, and asks for her gun back. Seon Ji-am agrees to give it back if she takes back what she just asked. Exasperated, she eventually agrees to his request and heads home. In the morning, Seon Ji-am gets dressed and heads out for an early morning run. On the way, he rings Woo-sik admitting that he drunk the night before, and now he's out running. Afterwards though, he heads to a supermarket and drops off a chocolate bar for a crying child, while taking off with a trolley full of food. That trolley is brought all the way up to prospective track athletes he's sponsoring who are all out practicing together. Unfortunately, thanks to the bad press circulating, the facility no longer wants Seon Ji-am associated with them. Instead, he settles on changing his name and going under an alias to keep up the funding. Assemblyman Kai attends Wonil Church first service with his wife. Both of them are simply playing along, but meet the young Assemblyman No there. Together, they sit down to eat after the pastor prays with them. There, Ji-woo takes Dong Kyung aside to talk outside. With a table read at 3 p.m., she speaks to Dong Kyung about the agency and in particular, how Seon Ji-am is getting along. Given the estranged relationship between her and her son, she asks Dong Kyung to check up on her. At the academy, Dan-ae receives a list of prospective husbands to secure her marriage, including Seon Ji-am. This gets her thinking, but for now decides to keep the idea on the back burner. At school, Lee Young-hwa falls asleep midway through his lecture. Hee-jun draws whiskers and a button nose on him, which certainly doesn't have its desired effect. He plays along with being a cat and thinks over his Rapunzel, that being Dan-ae of course. As he heads out to draw with the kids, he finds inspiration and draws Rapunzel's tower. Young-hwa learns that Hee-jun's mum is connected with Dan-ae, and intends to show up and make a big impression. Only Dan-ae is obviously the Ice Queen and blanks him completely. When he offers to pay for the bracelet with 500,000 won, she simply laughs it off and walks away. Dan-ae continues her hot streak when she runs into Myung-mun, calling him out for being an illegitimate son and not the rightful heir. Meanwhile, Mi-ju throws herself back into work, learning with horror from Wee-jin that rumors are spreading about her. They conclude that she only got the translating gig because she dated Seok-won. Thankfully, she's distracted by a message from one of her friends, confirming that they're getting married soon. In order to discuss the details, she's invited to attend a lunch date at the very same hotel Seon-jae is staying at. Mi-ju attends, but things quickly turn hostile when she disagrees about marriage. A cheek shot about Mi-ju's foster family eventually sees our translator leave. When she does, she runs into Seon-jae, who heads out and smoothly cracks a joke about the smoking area. He also invites her out to attend a dinner with Woo-sik, a thank you for translating Woo-sik's statements to the press. Both of them have great chemistry together as they discuss their changed fortunes. Mi-ju and Seon-jae head out to dinner as Woo-sik has invited them both individually. Only it turns out this was all a ruse to have the two reconcile their differences. Woo-sik is not actually showing up. Eventually they talk about their careers and what's going on in their worlds. Eventually they let down their guard and actually start to have a good time together. After saying goodbye, Mi-ju heads home and checks the news where she sees the truth has been reported on the sports page. She quickly gets to work translating the English words into Korean. News of this spreads all over Korea as Mi-ju heads to the internet cafe to help give this a push into going viral. Seon-jae sees the same news and quickly heads out in his car. With the rehab center shut, he tries his best to find Woo-sik, but struggles to do so. Instead, he finds Mi-ju who confirms that Woo-sik is quitting track. Mi-ju knows this is breaking his heart and throws her arms around the boy, hugging him. We begin episode 6 of Run On with Seon-jae waking up and getting dressed, ready to head out for his morning run, until he changes his mind and gets back into bed. Without purpose and no clear reason to run, he's struggling to find the drive to carry on. That evening though, Woo-sik rings to let him know that he's okay, and apologizes for not telling him the truth earlier. Meanwhile, Assemblyman Kai continues to try and save face, especially after Seon-jae's articles have broken out. The athletics board scramble to try and do the same too, deliberating over whether to send the kids for military service or not. Eventually they decide a 6-month suspension for Seon-jae. When he finds out, Seon-jae is not happy, believing he's getting special attention. Instead, he decides to retire from the sport completely and walks away with his head held high. Of course, Dan-A is none too happy either, but takes out her frustrations on Mi-ju, teasing her about a love triangle, and matching herself up alongside Seon-jae. Mi-ju holds her own though, prompting a cheeky smile from Dan-A before she turns her attention to the paintings. She wants to buy more of Young-hwa's work, but given he's given the latest to the cafe for free, she'll need to speak to him personally about selling up. Seon-jae appears as Mi-ju takes off her headphones and begins eavesdropping on his conversation with Dan-A. When he mentions retiring from the sport, Seon-jae confirms to Dan-A that she's no longer his agent anymore. Knowing that Mi-ju is watching, she grabs his hand, and then his face, to rile up the girl. It works too, as Mi-ju stands up, and immediately the two verbally spar, trading venomous retorts. Dan-A eventually leaves, leading Mi-ju to follow. Only, she's caught out when Dan-A tells her she's best suited to look after Seon-jae, now that he's on his own. It seems like Dan-A was teasing her all along, and has no intention of getting involved romantically with him. Anyway, outside Seon-jae helps out with posters being brought upstairs where Park Mae raises an eyebrow at him showing up with Mi-ju. After teasing her about the guy appearing everywhere she does, Park Mae agrees to let him stay at theirs for a few days. He graciously refuses though, and heads back to his cold, lavish hotel again. In the morning, he's invited to coach the team after the new articles have broken out. While he refuses, he does agree to help her out and find a suitable teacher, that being Ms. Bang, who's currently secluded and living a quiet life. Before leaving to visit her, he runs into Mi-ju and decides to take up her offer of staying at her place. Only it turns out the room he's staying in is actually the living room. That night, Seon-jae struggles to sleep, but Mi-ju too has trouble concentrating. In fact, while writing subtitles about Seon-jae, we cut to a hilarious skit involving Park Mae, Mi-ju and Seon-jae in the midst of drinking. Mi-ju finally snaps out of it, but clearly she can't stop thinking about him. With wildly different routines, Seon-jae heads out for a run and begins cooking when he gets back. Seon-jae is taken aback by her eating habits though, especially when she pours cereal into a mug, followed by a litany of vitamin supplements. Afterwards, Seon-jae heads out on a patrol and eventually drives Park Mae home. She tells him there's no need to worry about a love triangle, given she's asexual. Dan-A returns home, and the two kids get into a fight again over paintings. Dan-A, however, promises to bring his good one back. That, of course, being Yeonghwa's beauty hung up in the cafe. Anyway, out and about, Yeonghwa and Seonjae finally meet each other and strike up a connection. In fact, they touch fingers together like Eastern time in a hilarious segment. With Yeonghwa addressing him like a brother, the two look set to begin a bubbling bromance in the future. Back home, Mi-ju shows Seonjae her incredible schedule, including a meticulous timeline of events. Seonjae grabs her pen though, and adds in moments. In fact, Mi-ju also decides to head out for a run with Seonjae, believing it to be a fun exercise. Given it's her first time, then he tries to encourage her to move her arms rhythmically while running and how to keep a steady pace. While Lee Young-hwa heads in to see Danae, Tae-wing does his research and follows the guy on social media. Danae tries to buy Young-hwa's painting, even offering to have it featured in an art museum. Eventually he agrees to this and heads off, but not before leaving some honey for her to try from his parents' business. Meanwhile, Mi-ju and Seonjae hit the road, but the latter struggles to find Ms. Bang's property. While Mi-ju enjoys a treat from the local mart, Seonjae continues on to try and find her. Eventually she rocks up in a small tractor, with Mi-ju hitching a ride in the back. They agree to join her for food, but unfortunately Mi-ju winds up blind drunk again, and makes a complete fool of herself. It's pretty funny in truth, but Ms. Bang is not happy, and tells them to leave. As Seonjae puts Mi-ju in the back of his car, she holds his hand, and tells him not to go. Mi-ju admits she wants to see more of him, and asks him to like her. "I already do," he says back, as Mi-0ju is clearly too drunk to remember this interaction. After Mi-ju's drunken antics, episode 7 of Run On begins with her waking up with a blinding hangover. Seonjae happens to be asleep in the driver's seat. They're both invited in by Ms. Bang for breakfast. As we soon see, Ms. Bang was actually Seonjae's coach back in the day and she helped look after him. He also witnessed her beat up one of the coaches too, which he suddenly brings up in the present, while sat together eating. It turns out this coach is the one currently in charge at the moment. Anyway, after their conversation, Mi-ju and Seonjae head home, where the former reveals she doesn't remember much of what she did the previous night. After dropping off Mi-ju, Seonjae runs into Lee Young-hwa, who greets him warmly. He loads up his bike into Seonjae's boot and prepares to head off with him. They both show at Dan agency, but it appears as if Danae has wiped Seonjae's fingerprints. Standing outside together, Seonjae agrees to be Young-hwa's excuse for meeting Danae. Meanwhile, Mi-ju is given a big opportunity to help her old friend out with a translation gig. She's even invited to go along to the premiere for Gone for the Night too. Mi-ju shows up at the office late and greets May. He's been busy with the distribution schedule. While they talk, Assemblyman Kai bemoans what's happened with his son, wanting to use him as a way of connecting to young voters. He decides to use the movie premiere as an opportunity for a PR stunt, and shows up with his wife. He even invites Danae along to connect with Seonjae. Back home, Mi-ju greets Seonjae momentarily, before he heads off to get some stuff from his parents' house. While there, Seonjae winds up berated by his father, who encourages him to marry and get back on track with his athletics career. Seonjae refuses though, telling his father that it's his life and not him. Jeongdu doesn't see it that way, but Seonjae has had enough, turning away from his family. Just before he leaves, Jeongdu gives him a movie premiere ticket and invites him along to attend. Mi-ju hits the bookstore, where runs into Woo-sik. After a warm greeting, he buys her an iced coffee. The two sit together and discuss his changed career prospects, this time toward becoming a civil servant. After coffee, Seonjae shows up and walks with Mi-ju. The pair talk about their changing career prospects and what happens to retired athletes. While he's working, Young-hwa is approached by two avid fans of Tae-wing. Given how much of a social media influencer he is, they ask Young-hwa to introduce them to the rich kid. Young-hwa is confused, but suddenly realizes Tae-wing's surname is also Seo and wonders whether the pair are family. At the same time this is going on, Tae-wing confronts his sister about the painter, Young-hwa. She claims not to be interested, despite her dreamy, thoughtful gaze toward the honeypot. Eventually she throws his ID card in the trash, but finds herself glancing at it when Tae-wing leaves. Young-hwa shows up outside with Seonjae and the two talk again. They share drinks as the latter deliberates over Mi-ju leaving on a work trip. The conversation soon turns to Danae though, as he asks what relation she has to him. Apparently their families are acquainted and that's it. They soon start drinking together as Young-hwa adds honey to beer. Well, these few drinks soon turn into Seonjae getting drunk and waking up in the morning clutching a honey jar. When Miju finds out, she's none too happy with seeing Jaim and clearly annoyed. Anyway, despite her annoyance, she still shows up with Coach Bang for practice with the kids. He makes a big impression with them all while Bang and Miju begin to bond over seeing Jaim's irksome behavior. After practice, seeing Jaim talks to Miju about his night out, and the two finally straighten out their issues. Miju admits she was worried about him, but the two wind up in a pretty heated debate about the situation. Meanwhile, Danae shows up before Lee Younghwa, and he can't stop looking at her. Eventually he composes himself as the two head down and watch the local football team playing. Danae shows off her skills momentarily, while admitting that she used to be in a football club. That is, until her dad's son ratted on her and forced the girl to quit. As she opens up, Younghwa admits that he's grateful to learn more about her. At the movie premiere, Miju learns that Mei is running late. Instead, Sean Jaim rocks up, and although they're not reconciling just yet, they do agree to watch the movie together. Meanwhile, Jeong-do goes ahead with his PR stunt of giving his wife flowers in front of everyone. Jae-woo is not happy with him, especially the way he interferes with her fans too. However, it turns out his real move here is to find Danae and match her up with Seon Jaim, so they can join the two families together. Well, Seon Jaim and Miju have other plans, as Miju stamps down her authority and walks off while holding Seon Jaim's wrist. As they hurry, Seon Jaim can't help but smile. Episode 8 of Run-On begins with Seon Jaim and Miju walking away as Assemblyman Kai struggles to control his anger. Anyway, inside the theater, Lee Young-hwa eagerly awaits Danae showing up. Instead though, Jae Hyun takes his place next to sulking Young-hwa. After the movie, a teary-eyed Young-hwa arrives and asks why Danae didn't show up. Now Miju realizes that he was the guy Seon Jaim was drinking with the previous night. As they all head out for drinks together, Miju and Seon Jaim touch fingers like in Eastern time, a running joke here of course, but he quickly pulls away when Young-hwa returns. Back at the bar, he asks for Danae's number from Seon Jaim, complete with audio evidence, to prove she's allowed this. On a roll, he even asks for Seon Jaim and Miju's number. While Danae is trying to read, she's interrupted by a text from Young-hwa, and deliberates over his profile pictures of paintings. Anyway, she has more important matters to attend to when she talks to director Dong later that day. She believes it's in her best interest to try and help Seon Jaim. When Danae heads home, she immediately comes under fire from her family too. In fact, more of the truth comes spilling out here. It turns out Myung-min forged his birth certificate, and her father wants Danae to get married. Even worse, Dan 0A has taken her frustration out on Tae-woong, and pushed her brother away, forcing him to rely on superficial love from his fans, rather than that of his own family. Seon Jaim shows up at Dan's agency, where Danae immediately asks to marry him. Seon Jaim however sets her straight, nonchalantly telling her he doesn't like her. After a hard day at work, he heads home, and begins doing the housework, while Miju and Mei are out. Eventually they head to their apartment, and find the place less than hospitable, complete with ghastly covers and damp on the walls. Myung Bin-jangin is less than ideal for our couple, as Miju awakens to find Mei sleeping with her eyes open on her leg. Seon Jaim heads out, and sees his mother on the movie set. After a touching heart-to-heart, he messages Miju and the pair exchange messages. At least briefly anyway. Eventually Miju heads back to set, and does her best to try and translate the English. It's pretty tough work, but she does a good job translating the English into Korean, apart from one crucial detail about blood on the wall. She apologizes for the mistake, but asks for a bit more time between James' sentences to properly translate. Thankfully the director agrees to do this. It's a tiring day and one that ends with Miju worried she's getting a cold. However, that's the least of their problems when Gang's son bursts into their room later in the day. The translation was lost somewhere as James wanted a bus driver that doesn't speak English. Only, the one they've got most certainly can. Miju wakes up the next day as her worst fears are felt. She's really ill. She heads to a nearby hospital, where she's told she's overworking herself and making herself ill. Hooked up to an IV drip, Seon Jaim shows up at the hospital and begins talking to the two ladies next to her, allowing Miju get some sleep. Afterwards, he heads back to the apartments Mei and the others are staying at. Seeing the state of the accommodation, he decides to help everyone move to a decent hotel nearby. There, he drops off Miju's suitcase and eventually sits with her, holding the girl's hand while she sleeps. After her night holding Seon Jaim's hand, episode 9 of Run-On begins with Miju waking up and gasping when she sees her reflection. Her hair is a mess, and she's determined to look her best for Seon Jaim. Our runner meanwhile, is out for a morning jog. When he returns to the hotel, he helps himself to some noodles from the cafeteria and sits with Mi-ju, complimenting the girl on her good looks. Sean Ji-am jumps on this chance to make a good impression, especially after what she messaged him the previous night. Mi0Ju eventually introduces Sean Ji-am to James, who teases her over how hot the new man in her life is. Sean Ji-am arrives on set along with everyone else, and learns he needs to wait before driving again. That gives him the perfect opportunity to open his diary and write nothing. Sean Ji-am is unsure what to write, which is exactly what he tells Mi-ju when she shows up to ask what he's doing. Instead of procrastinating, Mi-ju encourages him to use her app and watch movies. There's way too many choices for him though, so instead he continues on, this time allowing his thoughts and feelings to come out properly. Back home, Lee Young-hwa continues to tutor his student, but she teases him, knowing that he's clearly in love with someone. He refuses to reveal who, but we obviously already know who that is. Afterwards, Young-hwa heads back to his studio and continues painting. Yi-jun shows up though and talks to him about his Rapunzel. Back on set, Young-il shows up to greet Sean Ji-am. Anyway, back to Run On. After spending time together, Sean Ji-am gives Mi-ju a new pair of running shoes with high arches, something to help her running style and prevent any ankle injuries. Mi-ju is troubled though, and admits to Sean Ji-am that she feels left out from some of the more important moments of his life. As they finally get their feelings out in the open, Mi-ju tells him she doesn't want to leave with him, as she may say something she'll regret. Sean Ji-am eventually opens up and tells her he's been trying to like her. While Mi-ju gets the bus home, Sean Ji-am drives. Meanwhile, Dan-A shows up before Young-hwa and asks where her painting is. Young-hwa tells her he's juggling a lot right now, what with school, tutoring and painting, and will have it done when it's ready. He holds his own against Dan-A, eventually calling her cute and leaving. Dan-A, however, can't stop thinking about him, and finds herself breaking into a wide smile in bed that night. It's a momentarily glimmer of kindness from this girl, and enough for her to ring Mr. Jeong and head out for drinks that night. Before she gets in the car, Dan-A asks him if she's cute. He dodges the question completely though, leading to an absolutely hilarious bout of silence. Meanwhile, Sean Ji-am begins cleaning with Woo-sik and catches up on current events. He discusses living with Mi-ju and the girls around him, before turning the attention to Woo-sik. Sean Ji-am tells his friend to focus on himself and do what's right for him. After a hostile encounter with director Seo, Dan-A shows up at Young-hwa's gallery to ask about her painting. He likens Young-hwa to a vending machine, which certainly annoys him. Clenching his fists, Young-hwa tells Dan-A that until he hands the paintings over, they belong to him, not her. It's a fierceness that certainly catches her off guard. We begin episode 10 of Run On with Young-hwa losing his temper and berating Dan-A. Only, she turns around and calls him a peasant, going on to blast him with icy rhetorics. She admits she'd rather see him fail than someone else take his paintings. Young-hwa signs, telling Dan-A all he wanted was to talk to her about paintings. Ms. Seo, you're the worst. In reply, Dan-A simply tell him this was just a business transaction and nothing more. It's his fault he got too invested in this. And with that, she walks away. Outside, she immediately rings Jeong and demands to have another artist hired ASAP. Things go from bad to worse for Young-hwa as he finds out he's late paying rent. Given he gave Dan-A 500,000 won, he struggles to swallow his pride and ask for the money back. Instead, he heads online and tells Myung-soo, Tae-woong's manager, to relay the message on to stop Tae-woong from following him on social media. As it turns out, Young-hwa actually took a picture of Dan-A, which is why he's getting social media attention. Young-hwa invites Sean Ji-am up to the rooftop of his place and admires the night view. He tells him it's his last month and bemoans the lack of funds he has. This, of course, is a guilt ploy to convince Sean Ji-am to cough up the funds for his rent. Well, it seems to work as Sean Ji-am immediately agrees and asks for his account details. In exchange, he's going to stay with him for the time being. Meanwhile, Mi-ju continues to mope around the house wondering about her job. She tells Mei she'd kill for a horror movie, even if it was written by Aaron Sorkin. For those unaware, Sorkin's films are notorious for overlapping dialogue and monologues. Anyway, Mi-ju is really hung up about Sean Ji-am and wishes she'd admitted how she felt to him back at the hotel. Well, Mei encourages her to head out and talk to the guy, laying it out on the line and admitting exactly how she feels. As she sits opposite Mei prepping food, Mi-ju goes through a number of different scenarios in her head over how she'll break the news. Eventually, she plucks up the courage to ring and asks Sean Ji-am to give back the jar of honey. She doesn't divulge when though, so instead sends a text with exact details. Meanwhile, slimy Assemblyman Kai meets Sherman Seo in a comic book store. The former does his best to get into the books, a ploy to try and bring their families together by matching up Sean Ji-im with Dan-A. Speaking of which, Dan-A and Sean Ji-im talk at the former's agency, discussing Woo-sik and his future in running. Sean Ji-im tries to convince her to sponsor Woo-sik, but Dan-A wants him to run marathons, instead given it'll give extra time for her agency to be featured on his clothes. Eventually the fateful meeting arrives and Sean Ji-im and Mi-ju greet each other at the park. As fate would have it, it's Sean Ji-im, not Mi-ju, who opens up about how he feels. He asks her not to hate him and apologizes. Eventually she leans forward and kisses him tenderly. They come to an agreement, and Sean Ji-im promises to do his best not to reduce her to a one-month girlfriend. He even tries to hold her hand on the way home. She's not that far along, yet though, so instead the duo discuss their careers. In particular, they talk about their passion, and how that can be tied with working. Mi-ju admits that the moment he decided not to run was like a scene out of a movie. It's here Mi-ju learns that Sean Ji-im is living nearby, at Young-hwa's house to be precise. As they awkwardly say goodbye, their interactions are incredibly cute. Mi-ju shyly tells him to text goodnight and hurries off. Back at An Academy, Kai Yun-bai berates Mi-ju for her coldness and claims that she's going to retire soon. Dan-A is not happy, but Kai Yun-bai agrees to be Sean Ji-im's shield for a bit longer. At least for now. It's clear Dan-A is struggling to get Young-hwa out of her mind, and heads over to Mi-ju's place. Mi-ju is not happy to see her, and initially shuts the door in her face. Begrudgingly though, kind-hearted Mi-ju invites her in, and the pair begin drinking together. Finally the truth comes out, and she begins talking about the painting, and how obsessed she is with Young-hwa. Only, she doesn't get much further as she passes out on the table. In the morning, a hungover Dan-A returns home where it's quiet, and sits with her father eating soup. He admits to being worried about her, and tells his daughter to take care of herself. Well, at work Mr. Jeong is tasked with bringing the honey back to Young-hwa, which he does, and wants Young-hwa to delete Dan-A's number. He does just that and eventually walks away. Woo-sik makes his decision and terminates his contract with the coach. He doesn't have to pay a penalty, but also doesn't want to be swayed by Seon Ji-im either. Woo-sik has already made his decision, and taken his grandma's advice to become a civil servant. He admits to Seon Ji-im that he's hurting inside, as well as outside, and begins weeping. He's sure he won't be able to continue, but Seon Ji-im decides to help Woo-sik, and coach him back to running again. If he can't make it as a runner, then he can give up. Episode 11 of Run On begins with Seon Ji-im heading out to eat with Woo-sik. They greet the latter's grandmother at a restaurant. There, Seon Ji-im asks about Woo-sik's rehab, and reminds the runner that a lot of this rests on good posture. At home, Seon Ji-im gets fully invested in Woo-sik's rehab, and begins devising a training plan for him. Meanwhile, Lee Young-hwa prepares for his TOE test. For those unaware, this is an English test and a requirement for Korean students. However, he's more interested in drinking, eventually seeing him stumble home reeking of alcohol. Obviously Seon Ji-im is not happy, but brushes aside the drunkard when he receives a phone call from Mi-ju. Seon Ji-im heads up to the roof, and sees Mi-ju down below on the phone. Shooting a big grin her way, he heads out for a night walk with the girl. There, they discuss the past and Mi-ju apologizes for what transpired between them. In the morning, Seon Ji-im heads for a morning run. After, he heads up to training and decides to take Woo-sik with him. After cleaning up Young-hwa's place, Young-hwa asks Seon Ji-im to drop by with his flash drive. It turns out Seon Ji-im actually left it in his fridge while cleaning. En route to college, Seon Ji-im runs into Tae-woong, but the former is not in the mood for talking. Seon Ji-im eventually saves Tae-woong from a bully who shows up to antagonize the celebrity. Unfortunately, when Tae-woong's identity is revealed, they're forced to run away from a stampede of screaming girls after them. Managing to hide and evade them, the trio catch their breath, but Tae-woong collapses, and is rushed into hospital. Once there, Young-hwa begrudgingly takes advantage of Tae-woong, and has him sign an autograph for Jae-yun, and then Hae-won. Seon Ji-im can only watch, puzzled at this taking place. With Mei struggling, and doubting her own skills as a translator, she encourages Mi-ju to show up and help. For now, Mi-ju decides to think it over. On the way out the door, Mi-ju bumps into Young-hwa who helps her carry shopping up the stairs. Eventually they sit together and talk, specifically about their respective love interests. Younghwa admits that he's narrow-minded and discusses with Miju the best way to approach his Danae problem. Miju later heads out with Seonjaim, with the enthusiastic former runner encouraging her to enter a half-marathon. Although they apply together, they're both in different groups. When Woo-sik shows up outside, he gasps as he sees Miju and questions Seonjaim's motives. Eventually though, the trio head up to the scheduled training. Woo-sik and Miju watch from the sidelines as Seonjaim trains the kids. Eventually though, Seonjaim has Woo-sik out jogging and doing laps with him. Of course, he's nowhere near his top speed for now. With Miju filming, the trio eventually watch the footage back and lavish praise on him. Meanwhile, Younghwa shows up at Dan Academy to see Danae. With a big grin on her face, she greets Younghwa and asks if he's yielded. He refuses to admit this, but she does give him 10 minutes of her time. Danae half-heartedly gives an apology before outright asking if he likes her. I did, he says honestly. Danae hands over a contract which Younghwa agrees to sign, giving him 3 weeks to get the painting done. It's clear she's hiding her feelings, though and this time it's Younghwa who comes across as the cold and distant one, telling Danae the 10 minutes are up and quickly leaving. Miju shows up at Dan Academy, but there's obviously tensions between her and Danae too. Eventually Miju asks to participate in the half-marathon and asks about Seonjaim. Miju is understandably cautious and remains tight-lipped about much of her life when Danae probes, specifically dancing around details surrounding her rough upbringing. Just before Miju leaves, she warns Danae and tells her she better let her compete in the half-marathon. That evening, Miju heads out with Seonjaim, and the two have an impromptu date at May's work. With a projector on, comfy pillows sandwiching them in and fried chicken, the pair watch a complex movie together. Afterwards, they discuss the specific plot points and ideas. Miju likens the movie to Seonjaim's personality, given how complex he is. As the two start joking around and being cute together, their natural chemistry oozes through every line of dialogue. Eventually, a drunken Seonjaim heads home. Meanwhile, Younghwa heads back to Dan Academy and asks to watch him paint. With a canvas already set up on an easel, Danae stands and watches the artist work. Younghwa uses an array of different strokes and shading techniques for his piece, but Danae eventually asks him to smile. Younghwa refuses to do so, telling Danae she needs to make him smile instead. Eventually she takes a gamble and heads over to Younghwa, kissing him. Episode 12 of Run On returns with Younghwa crying after Danae's kiss. He claims this is all a big ruse and believes Mr. Jeong is outside the door too. Eventually he leaves and begins crying, claiming to be falling for Danae again when he had moved past her. To try and calm him down, she decides to go out for a meal with him. She even offers to pay for the food too. Afterwards though he leaves, playing hard to get as Danae falls for this tactic. Remembering what happened in the past, she drags Younghwa to her car and gives him a lift home. After dropping the boy off, she questions her own motives, which is in turn echoed by Younghwa who asks just what she's doing. Eventually though he walks away and asks that she make her mind up about him. Meanwhile, Miju returns to the office as May shows her the note left behind by Seonjaim. She worries that his father may have something to say about them together, but for now, Miju is happy to try and weather that storm. Seonjaim continues to train Woo-sik, mixing in his cleaning job gig with rehab and running. The stretches and crunches he's doing at work all contribute toward being nursed back to full health too, which works perfectly for what Seonjaim's trying to teach him. That evening, Tae-wing arrives to see his sister. They discuss the gallery, with the former admitting he wants to try and lift her mood by offering it to her. In fact, Danae actually just wants her brother to be on her side for the upcoming family war with Myung-min and Myung-pil. As Tae-wing leaves, she wonders whether he's matured now. Well, Tae-wing heads to the bar and winds up speaking to Jae-hyun about Danae's stress and crying. Meanwhile, training continues for both Miju and Woo-sik. Miju heads out for an early morning run, while Young-il arrives to check on Woo-sik. Afterwards, Seonjaim heads out to get his eyes checked at the opticians. Miju is not happy with his choice of spectacles. Eventually, Seonjaim settles on contact lenses instead. Miju heads home after work and runs into Yoonba-ai, who admits that she's seen something strange. In fact, Assemblyman Kai has eyes all over town and knows that she and Seonjaim are dating. She warns Miju over what this means and tells her to be careful. After working all night, Miju decides against going for a run and sleeps instead. Danae decides to ring Younghwa. After some words of wisdom from Jai Hein, she tries her best to see Young Hua is obviously playing hard to get. While she's in her car, she watches as he skips away from the coffee shop. Young Hua eventually runs into Mi Ju, who's looking around outside his apartment. They head out for breakfast together, where Young Hua admits he needs help for his TOEIC test. After offering some tools to help, Young Hua and Dan A finally meet again, and this time are on the same page. Sean Jiam shows up to greet his sister, and saves her from their father and his friends. It's obviously that Kai is using her as a decide to further his political agenda. Given Sean Jiam's unpleasant greeting though, Jeongdu is left humiliated and turns his anger toward Miju. Kai immediately heads over to her place and blames the girl, claiming she's the reason why his reputation is going down. Miju holds her own in front of him though, threatening to get the police involved if he comes back again. Heading back up to her apartment, Miju begins crying. After a confrontation of his own with Kai, Sean Jiam shows up at Miju's place and apologizes for her father dropping by. Miju admits that she feels bad about the whole situation and tells him it's not his fault. However, she's not sure whether she can continue on. Episode 13 of Run On begins with a teary-eyed Miju telling Sean Jiam she doesn't want to be disappointed anymore. As she voices her problems, Sean Jiam asks if she wants to break up. Her silence speaks volumes as he presses her for an answer. Eventually Miju agrees to give it some time to think over what she wants to do. With Sean Jiam back home, Miju heads back inside and flashes back to an earlier conversation with Sean Jiam's sister about her dilemma. She doesn't want to lose sight of work, but finds it hard to deny her own feelings for Sean Jiam. Well, when she speaks to May about a movie, it brings back memories of her impromptu date with Sean Jiam earlier in the season. As she thinks over this night, Miju worries that she may have lectured Sean Jiam too much. Meanwhile, Young Hua does some research online and applies for the charity run. However, Sean Jiam is distracted and keeps mulling over exactly what Miju wants, and whether she really will break up with him or not. Thanks to her past relationships, Miju believes everything will fall apart sooner or later. Every time she's tried to rectify her issues in the past, her boyfriends have avoided the situation and worse, broken up with her. As she thinks this over with May, she realizes she's avoiding the situation. Elsewhere, Young Hua heads out with Dan A. Given her birthday is coming up, Young Hua asks her to come along and celebrate with him. Instead, she continues to hurt his feelings and calls him a vending machine. Back on the training field, Sean Jiam continues to train Woo Sik as he knocks his 100 meters time down to 10.38 seconds. At the same time, tensions begin to mount for Assemblyman Kai as his opponent in the upcoming elections. Assemblyman No begins to gain some ground. In the morning, Sean Jiam arrives all dressed up ready to represent Woo Sik. He meets the manager of the June construction track team, handing over a portfolio full of Woo Sik's stats and accomplishments, but he's rejected immediately. Unfortunately, Woo Sik has quite the reputation of being a whistleblower, and this is going to make Sean Jiam's job a lot harder. Although the manager apologizes for being rude, Sean Jiam leaves empty-handed. Unfortunately, this mixes with his disappointment surrounding Miju, and he finds himself alone. Sean Jiam watches a movie by himself and stays until the end credits. At the same time, Yoon Bai starts to struggle while golfing, which Dong Kyung suspects is a case of the yips. Meanwhile, Tae-woong receives some social media comments online from Young Hwa calling him babe, and he tries to get him to delete them. Getting nowhere, Tae-woong eventually shows up and admits that Dan-A is his sister. Unfortunately, everything goes horribly wrong and a big fight breaks out. As this spills over to the street, Seon Ji-am and Mi-ju wind up running into one another. With everything coming unraveled, Mei makes Mi-ju jump, which in turn leads to Dan-A's cake falling on the floor. The boot of the car slowly opens to show more happy birthday gear too, solidifying that Dan-A's birthday celebrations are a bust. As everything simmers down, Tae-woong admits that Dan-A wasn't actually born on this day, but her birth was only recorded after Myung-min's, further solidifying how little her father thinks of her. Meanwhile, Subin catches up with Mi-ju at the clinic, as it turns out she's being bullied. After eventually sorting out the situation, Mi-ju runs into Seon Ji-am and tries to run away. Only, he follows after her and holds the girl from behind. He pleads with her not to go and asks Mi-ju to lie. Episode 14 of Run On begins with Seon Ji-am holding Mi-ju and pleading with her not to let him go. She eventually turns around and hugs him, telling Seon Ji-am it's okay if he cries. After composing himself, Seon Ji-am admits that he's a little embarrassed that Mi-ju saw him in this state. After discussing the Subin situation, Sin Jaim tells Mi-ju he was worried that she would leave him forever. He promises to do better in the future and do his best to stop anyone coming between them. Of course, this is a direct reference to his meddling father. Well, Mi-ju invites him over to her place, but things are awkward, to say the least. They share a bed together and eventually, after a large bout of silence, discuss their future. She asks who will live with her forever, prompting Sin Jaim to incorrectly answer himself. She chuckles, correcting him and saying it's actually herself. They talk openly and she tells him to love himself more. If he can do that while maintaining a healthy bond with her, then the pair will have a good relationship going forward. When she asks for a kiss, he instead talks about food to lighten the mood. Eventually though, the pair finally kiss passionately while lying in bed. The next shot is of the sign on Mi-ju's door reading "No minors," so I think we can all guess what this is implying. Well, their relationship thrives. Assemblyman Kai and Yuk Jae-woo come to blows as the former claims Jae-woo should be his first lady. She bites back though, and warns him not to pigeonhole her. After all, she's always been the star of the show and even contemplates the idea of divorce. As soon as she says the words though, he looks set to strike her in the face. Thankfully he doesn't, but it's clear she's slightly rattled by this. Meanwhile, Young-hwa deliberates over the best way to apologize to Dan-ae. After the disastrous birthday celebrations, he worries she won't respond well. After sending a picture of a painting over and receiving a blunt reply, Young-hwa continues to paint and try to impress his lady. Back home, Mi-ju settles in to translate the movie codenamed Candy, but Dan-ae rocks up to talk. In another of these stylish throwbacks, Dan-ae and Mi-ju discuss the former's irritation and annoyance that Young-hwa organized a party for her. Mi-ju tells her to apologize, but Dan-ae doesn't know how. After a heavy night drinking, Dan-ae and Mi-ju both show up at his hometown. It turns out Young-hwa's mum was stung by a bee, and on the back of this, he rushed back to help. Hilariously, it turns out Dan-ae actually dressed Mi-ju and brought her along for the ride without her knowledge. Thankfully though, she packed her script and laptop so she can at least work, which is something. Dan-ae eventually heads out alone with Young-hwa as they walk around his childhood town. She outright asks whether they should get a room for the night, which certainly takes him by surprise. However, he certainly doesn't say no to this request. Sin Jae-im continues to try and find a way for Woo-sik's career to excel. Unfortunately, the whistleblower allegation continues to hold him back. With Assemblyman Kai a possible option, Sin Jae-im is loath to use his family contacts to better his prospect. Well, not long after he's given the lucrative option of joining Dan Agency again. Only, instead of an athlete he'd actually be working as an agent. Thanks to Yoon Ba-ai's case of the yips, it could be a good opportunity to put his skills to the test. Sin Jae-im agrees to think it over for now. Meanwhile, Seo Myung-pil is taken ill, while Myung-min and Tae-wing both show up to check on him. However, Myung-min hasn't bothered to tell Dan-ae about his condition. Even worse, he keeps Tae-wing in check with threats around his illegitimate bloodline. Young-hwa eventually heads out by the shore with Dan-ae to discuss their fortunes and how they feel about each other. It's finally a moment for Dan-ae to open up, and as they head back to the hotel room together, they lie on the bed and embrace one another. Young-hwa sings softly to her as she closes her eyes and lets herself feel comfort in his arms. The next day, Sin Jae-im heads in to see his father, but he doesn't want to see him. At least, not until Sin Jae-im apologizes to the chairman. Back at the office, Dan-ae runs into trouble as press releases and rumors begin to circulate surrounding Yoon Ba-ai having an affair. Dan-ae remains determined to try and fix this though. The next day rolls round and everyone prepares for the charity run. Dan-ae and Mi-ju are both running, but Sin Jae-im receives an unexpected call from his father asking to meet. It's now or never. Sin Jae-im eventually agrees to take his father's offer, but there's a catch. It turns out this apology is actually a disguise for Sin Jae-im being paired up with Dan-ae in a forced marriage to bring both families together. This is the only way he can get Woo-sik to train, which Kai calls his final kindness. While out running, Dan-ae collapses and is taken to the medical tent by Young-hwa. There, he learns she has tachycardia. This, as we soon learn, is the same condition that Tae-wing had, so it seems to be genetic. While they're in the tent together, a struggling Mi-ju continues on from behind, breathing heavily and struggling to run. Eventually she presses on and pushes through the pain, making it to the finish line. While everyone else has gone home and packed up, Sin Jae-im has stuck around to see her. Episode 15 of Run On begins at the finish line of the race as Mi-ju struggles to catch her breath. However, she touches fingers with Sin Jae-im and admits that she's glad she waited for him. Eventually they sit together and eat, where Sin Jiam reveals what's going on with his father as they deliberate over whether just to go over and apologize to smooth things out. Sin Jiam is not okay with this though, prompting them to change the subject over to Woo-sik. His running is going well, but he needs to wait for next spring before entering a race. Things are definitely looking good for him. As they talk, Mi-ju finally understands that Sin Jiam lives his life by taking one step in front of the other, taking things as they come while he competes. Dan-A drops off Young-hwa at his place. Mr. Jeong lends his support to her woes though, telling her not to think about the end as she's only just started with Young-hwa. Well, things take a turn for the awkward when Dan-A learns about the marriage proposal back at Dan Agency. Together, they decide all this marriage business is really to do with his father gaining Chairman Seo's support. If they play stupid for now, they suggest bailing at the last second. Mi-ju refuses to take Dan-A's snidey comments, though, and eventually heads back to confront her after the meeting. Mi-ju asks outright why she's acting like Sin Jian had feelings for her. Dan-A explains that he chose her agency rather than any other, and that's what swayed her decision to think this. Mi-ju eventually leaves, but not before telling Dan-A not to call him late at night anymore. Meanwhile, the truth about Young-hwa's friend Yi-jun comes out. He's gay, and tries to break the news to his mother, but it's less than ideal circumstances. Dong Kyung refuses to hear him out and drives away. Thankfully, Yi-chan is on hand to give Yi-jun some encouraging words to make him feel better. That evening, Young-hwa wants to cook pork belly, but needs a gas stove to do that. This prompts Sin Jiam to ring Mi-ju, who heads over to Young-hwa's apartment. As Young-hwa rings Dan-A telling her she's done with his painting, he's not, he's almost done, he just chose to omit that. He eventually heads out with Sin Jiam to get some shopping. Back home, Dan-A shows up and realizes Young-hwa has lied, prompting her to contemplate throwing him over the edge. Well, Sin Jiam and Mi-ju are all for it, especially after he lied to her, before Dan-A reluctantly agrees to join them at the table. A hilarious, vibrant dialogue ensues between the four before they head outside and see Mei in the playground. She's there on a date with Jai-hai and Jiyoung of all people, and awkwardness immediately ensues. As we cut back in time, we see Mr. Jiyoung falling for Mei. It was love at first sight. He handed her his business card and the rest, as they say, is history. Dan-A is clearly taken aback by this, but agrees to give Jiyoung his weekend and not ring him from now on. After this incident, Young-hwa hands over a birthday present for Dan-A, which happens to be new shoes. After, they discuss their future as Young-hwa admits he's going to keep his distance, so he can always see her. It's a really sweet moment when that sees Dan-A finally lower her defenses and let herself feel something for this man. Back at the office, Mi-ju shows up without makeup to greet her idol, Jai-woo. She's giggly, and more than a little giddy, especially when Jai-woo signs a piece of paper for her. Mi-ju also breaks the news about Sin Jiam being an agent. After staying up all night and working on codenamed Candy, Mi-ju staggers out of her room and greets Mei at the table. There, Mei shows her the scandal surrounding Yoon-bai and Assemblyman No, which has taken the internet by storm. Of course, Yoon-bai works at the agency Jiyoung is working for, and even worse, Kai's words about Sin Jiam ruining his sister seems to be coming back to haunt her now. With news running rampant across the agency, Sin Jiam shows up with his resume that he's been working on. Dong Kyung is stressed though, between the issues with Sin Jiam's sister and her own son's sexuality, but she takes the envelope and hopes to see him in an interview soon. Back home, Yoon-bai shows up at Mi-ju's as she and Sin Jiam listen to her story. She also explains the situation to her father afterwards too, who encourages her to be patient. Dan-A is next, who finds Yoon-bai out on the golf course practicing. Well, Dan-A joins in for a few rounds too, and after speaking to her, Young-hwa messages to inform he's finished her painting now, for real this time. Dan-A shows up to view the painting, and immediately marvels at the portrait. It's a marvelously noisy explosion of color, contrasting the beautiful image of Dan-A's face on the other side. She smiles, claiming the painting reflects Young-hwa's own feelings. And just like that, Young-hwa admits that he loves her. However, their happy moment is interrupted by a devastating call from Mr. Jiyoung that sees Dan-A rush out his apartment. He asks her to call, but she pulls away and drives off, leaving him to watch her go. Episode 16 of Run On begins with Mi-ju and Sin Jiam cooking, and both wearing red jumpers. He thanks her for listening to him all this time and reciprocates, asking questions about her past as she mentions her time in the French Riviera. In fact, he even suggests they go together one day. Meanwhile, Danae heads in to see her father who's currently sick and on his deathbed. She's not happy that he kept this from her as Tae-woong, Myung-min and Danae are gathered together to hear him tell them all I loved you. Unfortunately he passes away, just as Danae symbolically calls him dad. Myung-min heads straight out and starts working though, as Assemblyman Kai learns about the death too. Only, he's too worried about the wedding and what will happen with Seon Fiam's future. Young-hwa eventually heads out and meets Danae. He learns about the chairman's death and embraces Danae warmly, asking if she's okay. His death may not have hit her as hard as it could have done with a warm father-daughter relationship, but it does get her thinking about the end. Unfortunately she breaks things off with Young-hwa, believing that it's only going to end badly. She's unhappy about dragging him into her world, but he doesn't see it that way. In the wake of everything going on, it turns out Seon Jaeim's father was the one who started the scandal with Yoon Bae. He wanted leverage in the race to become a politician and use his kids as collateral. Seon Jaeim finds out from his father's former secretary that he's quit and also that his parents are debating about getting a divorce. With a lot on his mind, Seon Jaeim visits Mi-ju and asks her for advice. She eventually embraces him and convinces Seon Jaeim to talk to his sister. Well, he does just that, and while she weathers the storm, quickly calls their mother to tell her what's happened. Jae-woo is absolutely furious and immediately heads in to slap her husband round the face. She even vows to divorce him too. At Dan agency, Young-hwa arrives and hands over her painting. Her strong cold front suddenly fades away, and she begins sobbing. Young-hwa calls her his first love, making her promise to live long and not fall ill as he walks back home. He keeps it together long enough to see Seon Jaeim, where he loses his composure and breaks down crying. Meanwhile, Mi-ju heads out and meets Danae at the bar, who's currently drowning her sorrows in alcohol. She outright admits that she wanted Young-hwa around and eventually allows Mi-ju to comfort her. In the morning though she meets Sang-ho, who many will recognize as Kim Sun-ho, the man who played dashing Jae Pyong in Startup, who thanks her for helping. Elsewhere, Young-hwa starts to accept what's happened, as Seon Jaeim gets him a new gift in the form of a portable cooker. After, he meets Mi-ju following her meeting at the coffee shop, and lets her know that he's got a job as an agent now. Together, they head out and celebrate. With the funeral coming up, Danae asks Tae-woong to be her brother from now on, while Yoon Bae arrives with flowers to congratulate her mother on her divorce. Well, Kai loses everything in his fight to become the best, losing narrowly to Assemblyman No. He symbolically drops the pictures of his family in the office, and reflects on what's happened. Danae eventually heads into the coffee shop and apologizes to Yi-jun for the way she pried into his feelings. He outright admits that he does like Young-hwa as Danae herself thinks over her brash way of telling her father she was gay to get out of marriage. For that, she apologizes. However, this spurs Yi-jun on to head over and speak to Young-hwa directly. He finally admits that Young-hwa was his first love as he leans forward and hugs his friend tightly. With this part of his life settled, Yi-jun heads home where he and his mother eventually talk openly about everything. Dong-kyung feels guilty, given she didn't have much time for him in the past, as they discuss his up. Seon Jaeim heads out with Young-hwa to the track, where he wants to draw Woo-sik running. Only, Young-il shows up and breaks the news that he's getting married. Seon Jaeim is puzzled, given his obliviousness to this whole incident, as congratulations are thrown around. Danae shows up at the gallery as the new vice president, tellingly wearing the shoes that Young-hwa bought for her. There, she looks around at the various different pieces on display. She deliberates on Young-hwa's newest one, a bright painting full of color, with the outline of Danae showing in the middle. When Young-hwa shows up, he notices her wearing the shoes and compliments Danae. He asks Danae for her thoughts on the painting as she decides to make this day her real birthday. Mi-ju heads over to Seon Jaeim and breaks the news that a director overseas has noticed her work. Flashing him her home, she excitedly shows a text from them. The pair then head out running together, where Seon Jaeim and Mi-ju reflect on how they're different people. They promise each other that they'll stick to what's possible, and not to get caught up and frustrated if they misunderstand one another. And just like that, Seon Jaeim tells Mi-ju that he loves her. That afternoon, the two couples join together and toast to Mi-ju finishing her marathon. That marathon, of course, is symbolic for doing your best and persevering through tough times to make it to the finish line triumphant. As we cut forward in time, we receive a lovely montage. Woo-sik wins a gold medal after signing with Dan Agency. Mei and Ji-young share the same date that Seon Jaeim and Mi-ju did, and kiss while watching a movie. Seon Jaeim seemingly patches up his differences with Ji-young Do-too, who reflects on his actions while sat by the lake. As the episode closes out, all of our characters converge at the movie theater and watch Miju's movie. As rapturous applause rings out, this wonderful slice of life drama comes to a close. The last episode ending. What a satisfying conclusion to this tale. Run-On absolutely nails its ending in episode 16, managing to deliver some excellent payoffs to every single character's plotline. The only person here who perhaps could have been developed a little better is Assemblyman Kai, as it's not initially clear how much time has passed when we see him appear at the movie theater at the end. Could his family really forgive him that easily? As for the rest of the episode, there's so much to like here. Seeing Ji-am and Miju have come a long way over the weeks, with the former learning to grow thanks to Miju's influence. Both have been so good, and the ending scene, with them both in the cinema together and holding hands, just shows how strong their bond is now. The real stars of the show come from the secondary leads, with both Young-hwa and Dan-A in particular growing so much over the weeks. Dan-A's character arc has been nothing short of wonderful, and the moments with her in the hospital are a small but incredibly important part of her growth. Calling Chairman Seo dad instead of Chairman really helped her to move past the bad blood in the family and embrace Tae-woong as her actual brother, even if she sidestepped him leaning in for a hug. The moments with the paintings and Young-hwa's lessons in tough love finally shatter her walls, and the moments inside her office, reflecting over everything that's happened, do so well to show that underneath it all, this girl has had a seriously tough childhood. And what about the secondary characters too? Ji-woo putting her kids first and finally standing up to her husband has been coming for a while, and she dropped one heck of a slap to do it. It's another really satisfying and meaningful moment, one that finally sees this assemblyman learn that actually, when it comes down to it, family is much more important than achievements. That's before mentioning Yi-jun and his conversation with Young-hwa. Instead of being all weird about him coming out, he simply embraced his friend, which is great to see. The same can be said with the writing of Nate too, whose asexual lifestyle slots in perfectly alongside all these characters. The cameo was, of course, a lovely moment, but ultimately it's that montage at the end that really tops everything. They say a picture speaks 1,000 words, well, this montage does that and more. It rounds out a beautifully written drama about growth, life and self-awareness. Run-On is certainly a must-watch this year.